Roman devotio. In ancient Rome, the highest military honor a commander could achieve was devotio, a ritual self-sacrifice where a general would literally devote himself and the enemy army to the underworld gods in exchange for Roman victory. The most famous practitioners were three generations of the Decius Mus family, starting with Decius Mus the Elder at the Battle of Vesuvius in 340 BCE during the Latin War. The ritual required precise execution. The commander had to wear a toga praetexta with its distinctive purple border, veil his head, touch his chin to the ground, and speak an exact formula invoking Janus, Jupiter, Mars, Quirinus, and the gods of the underworld. After completing the invocation, he would charge alone directly into the densest part of the enemy lines, where death was certain. If by some chance he survived the charge, Roman religious law considered him spiritually dead, and he could never participate in religious ceremonies again. The Romans believed this ritual transfer literally moved the enemy's strength to their own forces while inspiring their troops with the ultimate example of sacrifice. His son and grandson would later perform the same ritual in subsequent wars, creating a family legacy of devotio that lasted over 50 years and became the gold standard of Roman military honor, demonstrating that commanders were expected to die first, not last. Seppuku for failed mission. When a samurai in Edo period Japan failed his lord, lost an important battle, or brought shame upon his family, death became the only honorable option. And seppuku, ritual suicide by disembowelment, was the carefully choreographed path to restore that honor. The most famous mass seppuku involved the 47 Ronin who, in 1703, committed ritual suicide after successfully avenging their master's death, choosing honor over life despite completing their mission. The ritual required meticulous preparation. The samurai would dress in white robes symbolizing spiritual purity, write a death poem, undergo ritual purification, and kneel on a tatami mat before witnesses. Using a tanto or wakizashi short blade, he would make precise cuts across his abdomen in a specific pattern, an agonizing process that could take considerable time. Behind him stood the kaishakunin, a trusted second whose job was to decapitate the samurai at the moment of greatest pain, though timing this correctly was considered an art requiring perfect judgment. Perhaps the most significant case was Asano Naganori, who in 1701 was ordered to commit seppuku for the crime of drawing his sword inside Edo Castle, a violation that demanded death despite causing no actual harm. The ceremony could last hours with formal witnesses present, and every detail mattered because the manner of death determined whether family honor was truly restored or further tarnished, making seppuku not just suicide, but a performance where the samurai's courage, composure, and adherence to protocol were scrutinized to determine his eternal reputation. Viking Blood Eagle. According to Norse sagas, including the Orkneyinga saga and the tale of Ragnar's sons, the Blood Eagle was a brutal execution method reserved for enemies who had gravely dishonored Viking warriors, though modern historians intensely debate whether it was actually practiced or existed only as a literary device to emphasize Norse honor culture. The most famous alleged victim was King Ella of Northumbria, who in 865 CE supposedly suffered this fate at the hands of Ragnar Lothbrok's sons as revenge for their father's death in a snake pit. The process, as described in the sagas, involved cutting the victim's ribs away from the spine and spreading them outward to resemble eagle wings, then pulling the lungs through the opening while the victim remained alive. The critical element for the victim's honor was silence. A man who endured the Blood Eagle without screaming was believed to earn entry into Valhalla, despite being executed, transforming a shameful death into an honored one through pure courage. Some scholars suggest it may have been a sacrifice to Odin, while others argue the graphic descriptions were metaphorical or exaggerated by saga writers centuries after the Viking Age to dramatize Norse values. Whether literal truth or symbolic story, the Blood Eagle represented the Viking belief that the manner of one's death mattered more than the fact of death itself, and that maintaining stoic courage in the face of unimaginable agony could transform even execution into a pathway to honor in the warrior's afterlife among the gods in Odin's Hall. Dual deaths of the Enlightenment. Between the 17th and 19th centuries, European and American gentlemen considered their reputation more valuable than their lives, leading thousands to die in formal duels over insults that today would seem absurdly trivial, yet refusal to duel meant social death far worse than physical death. The most famous American duel occurred in 1804 when Vice President Aaron Burr shot and killed Alexander Hamilton, one of America's founding fathers, over years of political and personal disputes that culminated in questions about Hamilton's honor. Duels were governed by elaborate codes like the Irish Code Duello, which specified everything from acceptable weapons to the precise number of paces between combatants, typically 10 to 20 steps, with pistols being the preferred weapon by the 19th century. Russian poet Alexander Pushkin died in 1837 fighting Georges Dante in defense of his wife's honor, a loss that devastated Russian literature. Andrew Jackson, who would become America's 7th president, participated in over 13 duels and killed Charles Dickinson in 1806, taking a bullet near his heart that remained lodged there for the rest of his life. Interestingly, many duelists practiced deloping, deliberately firing into the ground or air to satisfy honor without killing, demonstrating that the ritual itself mattered more than the death. French politician Paul de Cassagnac fought in at least 12 duels, surviving them all. Despite being illegal in most jurisdictions, dueling persisted among the upper classes because legal consequences were far less damaging than the social consequences of cowardice, and a gentleman's standing in society required demonstrating willingness to risk death rather than tolerate any perceived slight to his honor or character. Martyrdom in the Colosseum. During the first 4 centuries of Christianity, thousands of early Christians chose execution in Roman arenas, rather than perform the simple act of sacrificing to Roman gods or acknowledging the emperor's divinity, believing that such a death guaranteed immediate entry to paradise and eternal honor among the faithful. The Colosseum, which could hold between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators, became the most famous site of these martyrdoms, where Christians faced crucifixion, burning, wild beasts, and gladiatorial combat while crowds watched as entertainment. Perpetua and Felicity, executed in 203 CE, refused to recant their faith despite Perpetua being a young mother and Felicity giving birth in prison just days before their deaths. And their final writings show they viewed martyrdom as an honor rather than a punishment. Bishop Polycarp of Smyrna, 86 years old when burned alive in 155 CE, reportedly told his executioners that he had served Christ for 86 years and Christ had never wronged him. So why would he blaspheme his king now? Ignatius of Antioch, facing execution in Rome around 108 CE, actually wrote letters to Christian communities along his journey, begging them not to intervene or bribe officials to save him, as he desired the honor of dying for Christ. The Neronian persecution of 64 CE saw Christians burned alive as human torches to illuminate Nero's gardens. Ironically, Roman authorities intended these public executions to deter Christianity, but the courage of the martyrs had the opposite effect, with Tertullian later writing that the blood of martyrs became the seed of the church. As witnessing people die peacefully for their beliefs convinced Romans that Christianity possessed something worth dying for: sati. For centuries in parts of India, some Hindu widows performed sati, the practice of self-immolation on their husband's funeral pyre, an act that brought immense posthumous honor to the woman, her family, and her deceased husband, though historians debate how often this was truly voluntary versus coerced by social pressure in a culture where widowhood meant social death. The practice, called sati by British colonizers and sati in Sanskrit, meaning virtuous woman, was particularly associated with Rajput warrior culture, where queens sometimes performed mass johar, collective self-immolation, when their husbands died in battle. British colonial records documented 8,134 sati deaths between 1813 and 1828, though this was certainly an undercount, and Governor General William Bentinck formally banned the practice in 1829, though it continued in some regions. Women who performed sati were venerated almost as goddesses, with their sacrifice believed to purify the sins of multiple generations of their families, creating enormous pressure on widows to choose death over the harsh treatment society inflicted on surviving widows. The last prominent case occurred in 1987 when 18-year-old Rup Kanwar died on her husband's pyre in Rajasthan, sparking massive controversy and nationwide debates about tradition versus human rights. Some historians suggest the practice actually increased during the Mughal and British periods rather than being an ancient tradition. Modern India has strict laws against sati, and even against glorifying the practice, with the 1987 case leading to the Commission of Sati Prevention Act. The tradition demonstrates how honor cultures could demand women's lives to preserve their deceased husband's reputation and family standing, showing that honor operated differently for men and women, with women's honor often requiring them to cease existing entirely, rather than live as dishonored widows. Military Medal of Honor. The United States Medal of Honor, established in 1863 as America's highest military decoration, has been awarded to 3,536 service members for valor above and beyond the call of duty. But over 60% of those recipients, 2,119 people, received the honor posthumously because the actions required to earn it typically demand sacrificing your own life to save others. The most common scenario involves throwing yourself on a grenade to absorb the blast with your body, a category that accounts for at least 50 deaths, including Jason Dunham, who in 2004 covered a grenade with his helmet and body to save 2 fellow Marines in Iraq. The youngest recipient was 13-year-old Willie Johnston, a Civil War drummer boy, while 19 men received the medal twice, though all dual recipients served before 1920. The most recent award went to Captain Larry Taylor in 2023 for his actions during the Vietnam War in 1968, showing that recognition can come decades later. Living recipients often report profound survivor's guilt and feeling unworthy compared to those who died earning the same honor, creating a psychological burden where survival itself feels like a failure. The medal perpetuates an ancient military tradition similar to Roman devotio, where the highest honor requires commanders and soldiers to value the unit's survival over their own, institutionalizing the expectation that true heroism means death. This creates a complex moral situation where the military simultaneously wants to preserve soldiers' lives, while its highest honor system implicitly suggests that the most honorable thing a soldier can do is die saving others, making the Medal of Honor both an inspiration and a weight that can never be fully carried by those who live. Gladiator deaths for crowd honor. In ancient Rome, from the 3rd century BCE to the 5th century CE, gladiators fought in arenas like the Colosseum for the honor of public glory. And while many were slaves or prisoners forced into combat, some were free volunteers who chose this life, despite the constant risk of death, because victory could bring fame, wealth, and sexual desirability that free poverty could never offer. The most famous gladiator was Spartacus, who led a massive slave revolt from 73 to 71 BCE, but perhaps more revealing is Flamma, a gladiator who was offered freedom 4 times and refused each time, choosing to continue fighting because the honor and celebrity of the arena meant more to him than freedom and obscurity. When Priscus and Verus fought in the 1st century CE, they battled so skillfully and bravely that Emperor Titus granted both fighters their freedom simultaneously, presenting them each with a rudis, the wooden sword symbolizing liberation. The phrase, "those about to die salute you," or "Av imperator moriturita salutant," became associated with gladiators, though historians debate how commonly it was actually spoken. Contrary to popular belief, death rates were not 100%, with historians estimating 10 to 20% of fighters died in each combat, meaning the average gladiator survived about 10 fights before death. Gravestone inscriptions show that some gladiators took immense pride in their careers, listing their victories and expressing no regret. The paradox of gladiatorial combat was that slave status could bring more lasting fame than freedom, with some gladiators' names remembered 2,000 years later, while the names of free Roman citizens and even some emperors have been forgotten, proving that honor through public spectacle could transcend social class and even death itself. Kamikaze pilots. During the final years of World War II, from 1944 to 1945, approximately 3,860 Japanese pilots deliberately crashed their planes into Allied ships in suicide attacks called kamikaze, meaning divine wind, combining the ancient samurai Bushido code with modern aerial warfare and missions considered the highest possible honor in Japanese military culture. The first organized kamikaze attacks occurred on October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and these missions ultimately sank 34 Allied ships, while damaging 368 more, though the actual success rate was only 11.6% as most pilots were shot down before reaching their targets. The volunteers were often young students between ages 17 and 24, with the average kamikaze pilot being just 22 years old when he died. Before their final missions, pilots received ceremonial suck, wore hachimaki headbands decorated with the rising sun, and carried senninbari, 1,000-stitch belts that women had sewn with prayers for protection, creating an elaborate ritual around their deaths. One pilot named Yukio Araki wrote famous final letters expressing private doubts about the war, while simultaneously accepting his duty to die for the emperor and national honor. The kamikaze terrified Allied forces more psychologically than tactically, as defending against enemies who actively sought death, rather than feared it violated Western military logic, and created existential dread among sailors who knew conventional deterrence meant nothing. By 1944, Japan's deployment of systematic suicide attacks revealed the desperation of their military situation, yet the honor culture was so powerful that thousands of young men volunteered, and those who survived missions often experienced profound shame for failing to die rather than relief at living, demonstrating how national honor could be weaponized by the state to convince an entire generation that death was more honorable than survival. Honor killings. In communities primarily across the Middle East and South Asia, but also in diaspora populations worldwide, an estimated 5,000 people, predominantly women, are murdered each year by their own family members in what are called honor killings, where the victim's death is believed to restore the family's social standing after she has supposedly brought shame through actions like refusing arranged marriage, dating, seeking divorce, or even being raped. These murders differ fundamentally from domestic violence because they are about collective family honor rather than individual rage, with perpetrators usually being male relatives, like fathers or brothers who sometimes receive reduced legal sentences in countries with honor-based legal provisions. In 2016, Pakistani social media celebrity Kandil Balak was strangled by her brother for her modern lifestyle and online presence. 16-year-old Aqsa Parvez was killed by her father and brother in Canada in 2007 for refusing to wear the hijab. In the United Kingdom, Banaz Mahmoud was murdered by her family in 2006 for leaving an abusive arranged marriage, and British authorities recorded 91 honor killings between 2010 and 2014 alone. Pakistan has reported over 1,000 honor killings annually throughout the 2000s, though human rights organizations believe the actual numbers are significantly higher due to underreporting and cases classified as accidents or suicides. Victims find themselves trapped between traditional honor codes that their families still follow and the modern freedoms available in their societies, with their very existence seen as dishonoring the family name. The practice demonstrates that honor culture has not disappeared with modernity but continues to demand death. And unlike historical honor, deaths where individuals chose to die for their own honor killings involve innocent family members being murdered for someone else's concept of honor, revealing how honor systems can become tools of oppression that sacrifice the powerless to preserve the powerful's reputation. Self-immolation protests. Setting yourself on fire in a public space represents perhaps the most painful form of suicide. Yet throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, protesters have chosen this death to bring international attention to political causes, believing that the honor of their principles and the freedom of others outweighed their own survival and suffering. The most famous case occurred in 1963, when Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Quang Duc sat in perfect lotus position on a Saigon street while burning to death to protest the Diem regime's persecution of Buddhists, remaining completely motionless as flames consumed him in an image that shocked the world and changed American perception of the Vietnam War. In Czechoslovakia in 1969, student Jan Palach set himself ablaze to protest the Soviet invasion, and his death sparked massive demonstrations across the country. The most politically consequential self-immolation was Tunisian street vendor Mohamed Bouazizi, who in 2010 burned himself to death after police harassment and government corruption destroyed his livelihood, an act that directly sparked the Arab Spring revolutions that toppled governments across the Middle East and North Africa. Between 2009 and 2019, at least 135 Tibetans self-immolated to protest Chinese rule, creating an ongoing wave of sacrificial deaths. Ironically, American musician Malachi Richer set himself on fire in 2006 to protest the Iraq War, but his death received minimal media coverage, demonstrating that self-immolation's effectiveness varies wildly depending on context and timing. The process involves burns covering 100% of the body, with death typically taking several agonizing minutes as nerve endings fire continuously before being destroyed. These modern martyrs demonstrate that the ancient concept of dying for honor and principles persists, now serving political rather than religious purposes, with effectiveness measured not in spiritual salvation, but in whether their deaths actually change the political situations they died protesting. Hunger strikes to death. Political prisoners and activists who refuse all food until their demands are met, or death occurs face 30 to 60 days of progressive starvation, where their bodies consume muscle tissue, organs deteriorate, and death usually results from cardiac arrest or infection. Yet they choose this prolonged suffering to honor their principles and shame authorities into action. The most famous hunger striker was Bobby Sands, an Irish Republican Army member imprisoned in Northern Ireland, who died in 1981 after 66 days without food, and remarkably he was elected to British Parliament during his hunger strike, making him a member of Parliament who starved to death while imprisoned by the government he officially served. 9 other Irish Republican prisoners died of hunger strikes that same year, bringing the total to 10 deaths in 1981 alone. Terence MacSwiney, the mayor of Cork, died in 1920 after 74 days of hunger strike, one of the longest recorded. Suffragettes in early 20th century Britain conducted hunger strikes to demand women's voting rights and were forcibly fed through tubes, with some dying from complications of this brutal process. Hunger strikes create a no-win situation for governments, because allowing the striker to die generates international sympathy and outrage, while giving in to demands appears weak and encourages future strikes. The human body with water but no food typically reaches fatal organ failure between 45 and 60 days, though individuals vary. Mahatma Gandhi performed 17 hunger strikes throughout his life, but carefully calculated when to end them before reaching the point of no return, understanding that the threat of death could be as powerful as death itself. Bobby Sands' death sparked riots and international condemnation, ultimately achieving many goals posthumously that seemed impossible while he lived, demonstrating how hunger strike deaths often succeed politically, even as they fail personally, creating modern martyrs whose slow, deliberate starvation transforms into honored sacrifice rather than simple suicide. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.